I am going to be talking about the US history of reproductive rights for people with disabilities. And then at the end, we will have a chance for a discussion that will also be recorded, and then we can turn off the recording and continue discussing if you all would like. First, I'd like to talk about eugenics, which is a theory that just is foundational to a lot of the history surrounding disability and sexuality throughout really since the history of the United States. Eugenics is, or in definition, improving the human race by selective reproduction, which means choosing which people get to reproduce and have kids and which people do not. The idea has actually been around for a long time, since Plato's time. Plato talked about it, but it only really became popular, became known as eugenics in around the 1800s. So during the 1800s, it was developed by Charles Darwin, who was a famous scientist, and his cousin, Francis Galton, who was a statistician. The work done by Galton first developed a lot of popularity behind the word eugenics. And in fact, the word normal, which is a word that is so common today and has such a strong meaning, did not actually mean regular or healthy or typical before Galton in Darwin's time. Before that, it was used more as either a measure of like normal, like how we use it in geometry, like perpendicular, or other like practical terms. But Galton, in his study of eugenics, was trying to figure out how to describe the ideal population and came up with an idea that everybody should try to be more like the normal, or the ideal. So he kind of first created this association between being normal and being regular, and that we all know that word normal has gone on to cause a lot of problems in a lot of ways in society today. But that was first used to be associated with regular or healthy back in the 1840s. And then going on in the 1880s, 1883, Galton first used the word eugenics, and it became popularized through social Darwinism, which was a pseudo-scientific theory that was developed as a spin-off of Charles Darwin's findings in his science. That was basically a theory that the people who are the most fit to survive, or animals who are the most fit to survive, are the ones that will survive. And this idea of eugenics developed throughout history and throughout the course of the 1800s to cause an association between disability and being a criminal, and also associated disability and criminality with different ethnic and racial groups and with poverty. So many of these things were lumped together and associated with each other in order to try to get rid of them from the population. In early practices surrounding disability and sexuality, throughout early Western history, disabled people were often abandoned and sometimes even executed. And also up through the 1800s, many disabled people were incarcerated in poorhouses, almshouses, or jails with other minority groups. So there you can kind of see this grouping of a lot of different marginalized identities, all in these poorhouses that were under-resourced and often exploited the residents for their labor. And during the revolutionary period, some thinkers started to develop special schools for disabled people that were really just segregated schools that housed and trained people with disabilities. And within those schools, there was very little to no tolerance for displays of sexuality. So it was very difficult for someone in those areas to be able to develop an understanding and education about sexuality and what that means and sexual health. Guardianship was another barrier to sexuality that happened and has been around since the colonial time in the United States. Guardianship is a term that gives another person or government control over someone's decisions when that person is decided to be incompetent or unable to make their own decisions. Another form of guardianship was civil commitment, which was also a lot more common in the colonial period, which was a government acting as a guardian for an individual. When a lot of families had children put under guardianship, they would often look at them through something that's known as forever child syndrome, basically thinking that people with disabilities are always innocent and never have interest in sexuality. And for that reason, a lot of disabled people who are under guardianship were hidden away by their parents and never had opportunities for relationships or for marriage. Also, many disabled people under guardianship were institutionalized, especially people who could become pregnant, who were often sent away during puberty, and parents did not know how to cope with that. For example, there was one institution in Pennsylvania that was specifically for people who could become pregnant that was called the Pennsylvania Institution for Childbearing Women. And in this slide, there's just an image of a document that shows just a legal document that's giving guardianship of one person to another person. And this was in the 1890s. I mentioned institutionalization as a consequence of guardianship in the last slide. Institutionalization was when people with disabilities were segregated into often overcrowded and unsanitary environments. That was often done to, when put in positive terms, to put them together to make it easier to provide medical care. But what really happened was that there was very unsanitary conditions and often cruel treatment. There was restraint and no access to sexual freedoms, and people in institutions were often sterilized. And people in institutions were also often punished for any romantic or sexual behaviors that they did display. So in these institutions, it was not really possible to develop any understanding of best practices around relationships and sexuality. One thing that helped to put more people into institutions and also keep them out of general society was ugly laws. That's the colloquial term for them. Ugly laws prohibited diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed people so as to be unsightly or disgusting object or improper from existing in public. And that is a direct quote from a law. These people were often removed from the streets and then put into institutions. And these were created so that people with disabilities and minorities and people in poverty would not be able to be in the community and socialize with other members. The first ugly law was in 1867, and the final one was repealed really recently, actually in 1974, and after an arrest that happened that very year. There was also a period called deinstitutionalization, where activists who spoke out about the bad treatment conditions in institutions, as well as the creation of antipsychotic drugs that would make it easier to treat people out of an institution brought in a wave of people who wanted to release people from institutions to live back out in the community. This happened in about 1955 when it began. But in reality, this looked a lot more like a transition from people in mental institutions to living in jails and prisons. And a lot of this happened without preparation in society for real deinstitutionalization and what that would mean. And what you can see in this graphic on the left is there's a graphic that looks like basically two big humps, like in a camel. And it shows the number of people who are incarcerated either in institutions or in jails and prisons. And the first hump that goes from about 1934 to like 1970 is very tall. And the majority of it is made up of people who are in mental institutions and institutions for people with disabilities. Then that goes down, showing that people were released from institutions during the deinstitutionalization movement. But then following that, like beginning in the 1980s and continuing to 2000 and also till today, the number of people who are incarcerated has increased almost to the levels of beforehand. But this time it's not through mental institutions, it's through people being put into jails and prisons. One other aspect of deinstitutionalization was the 1999 Olmsted Supreme Court Act, not Supreme Court Act case, that said that the unjustified segregation of people with disabilities constitutes discrimination in violation of Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that really created a push for creating more services that would allow people with disabilities to live in the community and receive the care that they need and deserve. Before the onset of the movement of forced sterilization that a lot of people might know about, there was also a movement for outlawing marriage between people with disabilities. And these were a preset, basically a precursor to later laws that would cause forced sterilization. In 1896, Connecticut was the first state to prohibit people with disabilities, which in their words, they said feeble-minded, imbeciles, or having epilepsy, to marry or to have sex. And if they did, or they were found to have married or have had sex, they would face 3 years in prison. And multiple other states passed these laws. And later they turned into sterilization laws. And here on the left of the slide, there's a poster, a propaganda poster made during the time of eugenics that talks about basically what I was talking about before, where people with disabilities were associated with criminality and poverty. There's a circle of words that goes around a image of a face of a person, and the words say juvenile court, house of refuge, jail, police court, workhouse, charity, city hospital, and infirmary. And the name of this circle with this person's face is called the Wheel of Vice, Crime, and Pauperism. So it is a depiction of how people viewed people with disabilities in marginalized communities at this time, of all of them being directly connected to criminality and things that were unsafe for the population. The forced sterilization movement began in 1907 when Indiana became the first state with a law that allowed doctors to sterilize institutionalized disabled people without consent. Forced sterilization is a medical procedure without consent that prevents people from being able to have children or reproduce. There was a Supreme Court case about forced sterilization in 1927 called Buck versus Bell, but the Supreme Court actually upheld these laws. And in 1942, the Skinner versus Oklahoma case was the first time that the Supreme Court actually denounced forced sterilization. But these laws for forced sterilization actually continued well into the 1970s and do continue today. And by the 1970s, over 60,000 people had been forcibly sterilized under 33 state laws. What a lot of people cite as the most important court case to mark an ending of some sorts to forced sterilization was in 1974, the Ralph versus Weinberger, Alabama case that ended state funding of forced sterilization there. But in fact, it is something that continues today, albeit at much less levels than it happened during this period. Concerning parenting rights, the court case Buck versus Bell that upheld forced sterilization also removed parenting rights from people with disabilities and has been used as precedent since then to remove children from people with disabilities. And it was historically common for, if someone with disabilities had children, for them to be removed in a lot of cases. 1979, in the court case regarding the marriage of Carney in the California Supreme Court, was one of the widest known cases to retain child custody with disabled parents. In terms of reproductive and child services access, most services through the 20th century were simply inaccessible, either due to policies, to stigma, or just simple inaccessibility of equipment or ability to arrive at clinics. The 1973 Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act was supposed to, in theory, say that all clinics and services must provide access for disabled people. However, that law did not have much of a way for it to be implemented. Then in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was the first civil rights law for people with disabilities and had a lot more teeth behind it, and said that health clinics needed to have meaningful access to services, and not just health clinics, but buildings and services and companies all around, even outside of health. Finally, sexual education access was something that was not really thought about for people with disabilities until after the deinstitutionalization movement, when many people who had never received sexual or social conduct education were released from institutions and put into general society. And it was found that they had a hard time integrating back into society, a lot of times because they had never been given this education about relationships or sexuality or social conduct, which spurred in lawmakers an idea to start thinking about having sexuality education in this population of people with disabilities. So in 1975, the passage of the Handicapped Children Act, which is now called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, mandated education for people with disabilities. And this did include, in some cases, sexuality education, although this education often focused on preventing pregnancy and risks so that people with disabilities would not have children or contract STIs, rather than focusing on a more empowering form of sexuality education. Then in 2006, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities said that people with disabilities have the right to have the same range and quality of sexual education as non-disabled people, which was in response to that lack of quality in education about sexuality for people with disabilities. So thinking about all of these things from the past in sexuality education for people with disabilities, while we would wish that a lot of them were over, there's actually a lot of ways that we can see echoes or reflections of them in modern day life. For example, there's a lot of policies today that prevent marriage and sexuality. About 2 million people with disabilities are still institutionalized in the US as of 2021. Guardianship is still a thing, even while technically not allowed to prohibit sex, guardians can prevent someone from going on dates or meeting people if they decide to do that. It has been shown in studies that people in guardianship are less likely to go on dates or to marry. And some guardianships take away the ability to marry without a guardian's consent. There's also laws that make it difficult to get married. For example, Social Security can be greatly reduced and risk losing healthcare coverage if someone gets married and they have a disability. And even if you're living together with another person while you're unmarried, couples can be judged to be holding out to try to get out of that reduction of benefits, and then they'll still face that benefit penalty. Forced sterilization is unfortunately still legal. In the graphic on the right hand of the slide, there's a map of the United States where in dark purple, it shows the number of states that still have laws allowing forced sterilization. And then there's only 2 states that are shown in green where forced sterilization is banned. Then about half of the rest of the states in the US are in light purple, which shows that it's not clear if forced sterilization is allowed or not. People with cognitive and non-cognitive disabilities are more likely to be sterilized and at younger ages than non-disabled people today. Some states have even passed forced sterilization laws as recently as 2019. And this does happen more often in situations of guardianship or incarceration. For example, and especially in people of color and low-income people are at a higher risk of being sterilized without consent. Parenting rights are still a really high priority today, where discrimination exists in cases of custody and in adoption. And between 40 to 80% of parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities have their children taken away from them. And 2/3 of dependency statutes say that disability alone can be used to determine a parent is unfit for being a parent. Finally, in healthcare and education access, 36 states fail to include youth with disabilities in their sex education requirements or provide resources pertaining to accessible sex education curriculum for youth with disabilities. There's a very large lack in accessible healthcare, including discrimination in receiving reproductive facilitating technology, and also inaccessibility due to inaccessible medical equipment, physician bias, financial inaccessibility, and other things. There's also discrimination and a lack of receipt of childcare services for children of people with disabilities.